Have you ever noticed how someone who seems emotionally distant somehow ends up living rent-free in your head? You catch yourself replaying old conversations. You wonder what he really meant by that one comment. You feel a strange sense of connection even during the moments when he goes quiet on you. And here is the twist that most people completely miss when an avoidant partner is constantly on their mind. It usually means something powerful is already unfolding on his side too. Not in the obvious sweeping romantic movie kind of way, but in a much more subtle, internal, and honestly confusing way, because that is simply how avoidant people experience attachment. So if you have been sitting there asking yourself why you cannot stop thinking about him, or wondering whether he even thinks about you at all, let me walk you through 6 things that are already happening inside him, whether he ever admits it out loud or not. Understanding this does not mean you are trying to manipulate anyone or force something that is not there. It simply means you deserve to understand the psychology behind the confusion you have been feeling, so you can stop questioning your own worth every time he goes quiet and start recognizing what is actually happening underneath the surface of his behavior. When an avoidant cannot stop thinking about you, it is often because you have triggered something far deeper than simple attraction. You have activated his emotional alarm system. And no, that does not mean panic in some dramatic sense. It means his internal sense of balance has been disrupted. Avoidant people feel most comfortable when they are in control of their emotions, their personal space, and the pace at which a connection develops. You changed all of that without even trying to. You showed up in a way that felt genuinely real to him. Maybe you were emotionally present in a way he was not used to. Maybe you listened without judging him. Maybe you never demanded closeness, but instead simply offered a sense of safety. And that is exactly what sets off the alarm, because emotional safety naturally invites intimacy, and intimacy directly challenges the avoidant's core coping strategy, which is distance. So now his mind keeps circling back to you, not because he is scheming about how to get closer, but because his nervous system is genuinely trying to make sense of a connection it does not fully understand. You represent warmth, understanding, or emotional depth, and all of those things quietly challenge the walls he has spent years carefully building. His thoughts return to you again and again because part of him recognizes something meaningful is happening, while another part of him has absolutely no idea how to respond to it without feeling like he is losing control. This inner conflict is genuinely exhausting for an avoidant person. He might feel relatively calm when he is busy, distracted, or physically far away from you, but the moment stillness settles in, you resurface in his mind, not as some pleasant daydream, but as a nagging question. Why did that feel different from everything else? Why do I keep missing that one conversation we had? Why does her presence feel both grounding and unsettling at the exact same time? There is a reason stillness is often when this happens. Busyness gives an avoidant person a legitimate excuse to avoid sitting with his own feelings, work, hobbies, other people. All of it becomes a convenient distraction that keeps him from having to face what is actually going on inside him. But quiet moments strip that distraction away. Late at night, or during a long drive, or in the few minutes before sleep, there is nothing left to hide behind, and that is exactly when you tend to surface most persistently in his mind. And here is the part that most people completely misunderstand. His emotional alarm does not push him toward taking action. It pushes him toward analysis instead. He replays certain moments in his head. He questions your intentions. He searches for logic that can override what he is actually feeling. But emotions simply do not work that way. The harder he tries to suppress them, the louder they end up becoming. That is exactly why he might come across as distant, inconsistent, or slower to engage than you would expect. Not because he does not care about you, but because caring has activated something deeply unfamiliar inside him. You have interrupted his emotional autopilot, and once that happens, his mind does not let you go easily. So if he is on your mind constantly, understand this. It is often because you are already living inside his mind too. You did not chase him. You did not force anything. You simply connected with him in a real way. And for an avoidant person, that alone is more than enough weight for him to carry, more than he can easily ignore or shake off. When an avoidant is thinking about you constantly, it rarely shows up in obvious, visible ways. You will not always see long, heartfelt messages, emotional confessions, or big romantic gestures. Instead, it happens quietly, behind closed doors, in private moments where absolutely nobody is watching. Avoidant people are private processors by nature. They do not externalize their emotions outward, they internalize everything instead. And that is exactly why you can feel completely forgotten while, in reality, you are still very present inside his inner world. He thinks about you during the quiet pauses in his day, when he is driving somewhere alone, when a certain song comes on the radio, when something small reminds him of a conversation the two of you shared. But instead of acting on any of those thoughts, he simply holds them inside. For an avoidant person, openly expressing emotion feels genuinely risky. It opens the door to vulnerability, to expectations, and to a loss of control that terrifies him on some level. So instead of reaching out to you, he retreats further inward. This is exactly where confusion tends to begin for the other person involved. You might naturally assume that his silence means indifference, but for avoidant people, silence is often precisely where their emotions actually live. He is replaying certain moments in his mind, analyzing the tone of your voice, wondering exactly what you meant by something, questioning how close things were really getting between you two. You exist inside his mind as an unresolved presence, not something he has simply dismissed and moved on from, but something he is quietly, carefully examining. And here is the important piece to understand. Avoidant people often feel their emotions more intensely after separation than they do during actual closeness. When you are not physically right there in front of him, his defenses naturally lower. He feels safer sitting with his thoughts than he does feeling things openly in the moment. So ironically, the distance actually creates more space for you to occupy his thoughts even more deeply than before. That is exactly why he might appear completely calm on the outside, while feeling genuinely unsettled underneath the surface. He does not talk about any of this with his friends. He does not label what he is feeling as missing you. Instead, it shows up as restlessness, as distraction, as a subtle nagging sense that something has been left unfinished between you two. He might even convince himself that he is simply thinking things through logically, when in reality, his emotions are finding indirect ways to surface anyway. This kind of private processing can drag on for a genuinely long time. Avoidant people do not rush toward emotional conclusions. They sit with their feelings, turn them over repeatedly, and test them against distance before reaching any kind of decision. This is often the hardest part for the other person to accept, because we naturally want proof, some kind of visible sign that we matter. A text message, a phone call, a clear declaration. But an avoidant person's proof rarely looks like that. His proof looks like a memory he cannot shake, a comparison he keeps making without meaning to, a restlessness he cannot quite explain to himself, let alone to you. Learning to read those quieter signs without needing him to spell everything out loud is often the difference between constant anxiety and a calmer sense of understanding. So if you keep resurfacing in his thoughts without putting in any extra effort on your part, it is because the connection you shared was never actually superficial. It reached a level of depth that his mind simply cannot easily dismiss or explain away. So if you are not seeing obvious external signs, please do not assume that nothing is happening internally. With avoidant people, what matters most is almost always happening beneath the surface, rarely out in the open for anyone to see. If you are consistently on his mind, it is often because you have quietly, deeply become part of his internal emotional landscape far more seriously than he may ever be willing to admit out loud. When an avoidant person starts feeling a genuine emotional pull towards you, it never arrives with clarity or confidence. Instead, it arrives wrapped in contradiction. One moment he feels genuinely drawn to you, your presence feeling grounding, familiar, even safe. And then the very next moment, his nervous system reacts as though something dangerous is happening right in front of him. That constant internal push and pull is exactly what most people around him never actually get to see. Connection activates two completely opposing forces inside an avoidant person. On one side, there is genuine curiosity, attachment, and emotional resonance. On the other side, there is a real fear of dependency, a fear of losing his autonomy, and a fear of being needed or seen too deeply by another person. When these two forces collide inside him, his mind goes into overdrive. He wants closeness with you, and then suddenly he feels a strong urge to pull back again, not because the feeling itself disappeared, but because it actually intensified beyond what felt comfortable. This is exactly where the quiet panic begins to set in. Not the kind of panic that looks like a full-blown anxiety attack or dramatic behavior, but the subtle discomfort of feeling emotionally exposed in front of someone. His body interprets closeness as a form of pressure. The more he actually cares about you, the stronger his instinct becomes to create some space between you two. And that is exactly why you might notice those confusing mixed signals: warmth followed suddenly by distance, genuine interest followed by unexplained silence. What is important to understand here is that this particular reaction is not really a conscious choice on his part. It is a deeply conditioned response. Many avoidant people learned somewhere early in life that emotional closeness eventually led to disappointment, to feeling overwhelmed, or to a painful loss of self. So when something genuinely real starts to form between you two, his internal system tries to protect him by pulling away, even though emotionally he is still very much connected to you underneath it all. And here is the truly confusing part for you to sit with. The pull he feels toward you does not actually stop the moment he withdraws. In fact, it often grows even stronger during that time apart. He tends to think about you more when he is away from you than when he is physically close to you. Distance gives him some temporary relief from the emotional intensity, but it also leaves plenty of space for longing to creep back in. That is exactly why he might seem outwardly calm right after pulling back, while internally you remain very much present in his thoughts. This internal conflict naturally creates hesitation in his behavior. He might delay responding to your messages, avoid clearly defining what the connection actually is, or deliberately keep things vague and ambiguous between you two. Not because he does not care about you, but because gaining real clarity would force him to fully confront just how much he actually feels. Avoidant people often genuinely prefer sitting in uncertainty over facing real vulnerability. So if you sense this particular emotional tug-of-war happening, trust your intuition on this one. The push away is not evidence of an absence of feeling. It is actual evidence that the feeling exists in the first place. When an avoidant person feels both drawn toward you and afraid of that very pull at the same time, it means the connection has reached a level he genuinely does not yet know how to handle. And until he learns how to regulate that underlying fear, this particular push and pull dynamic will continue quietly, internally, and very much for real. Avoidant people do not become preoccupied with other people casually or by accident. When someone stays on his mind consistently, it is because that person has crossed an invisible internal threshold, moving from simply being interesting to becoming genuinely emotionally significant to him. And significance is not something an avoidant person hands out easily or to just anyone. It means you have affected him in a way he cannot fully rationalize away or simply dismiss. Emotional significance tends to show up when you make him feel genuinely seen without applying any pressure on him. You did not demand closeness from him. You did not chase after reassurance. You simply allowed him space while still remaining present in his life. That particular combination is genuinely rare, and for an avoidant person, it is disarming in a way that few other things are. It creates a real sense of importance without any accompanying sense of obligation, and that is precisely what manages to slip past his usual defenses. Now, because you genuinely matter to him, his mind starts treating you differently than it treats other people. He does not just think about what you said to him, he thinks carefully about what it actually meant. He replays certain moments not out of simple nostalgia, but because those particular moments challenge the way he normally relates to other people. You did not fit neatly into any of his usual emotional categories, and that unsettles him in a quiet, persistent way that lingers. This is exactly where confusion often tends to arise. Emotional significance does not always translate into immediate action on his part. In fact, for avoidant people, it often causes a noticeable delay instead. Taking action would mean fully acknowledging his own vulnerability. It would mean admitting that someone actually has the power to affect him emotionally. So instead, he holds you carefully in his thoughts, in his memory, in private reflection, quietly trying to understand the impact you have had on him without fully surrendering control of the situation. And here is the deeper truth behind all of this. Emotional significance genuinely creates attachment, even when an avoidant person resists putting a label on it. He might tell himself he is simply curious, simply being reflective, or simply being logical about the whole thing. But if you are consistently occupying his thoughts, it is because you have become emotionally anchored somewhere deep in his internal world. You represent real depth to him, not just a passing distraction. This is also exactly why he might feel genuinely protective over the connection without actually knowing how to nurture it properly. He might keep things deliberately undefined, slow, or quiet, not because he wants to lose what you have, but because he genuinely does not know how to hold on to something that matters to him without risking real exposure of himself in the process. So if you have been wondering whether you truly meant something to him, understand this clearly. Avoidant people do not struggle over people who feel insignificant to them. They struggle specifically with the ones who matter enough to genuinely disrupt their emotional equilibrium. If you have reached that particular level with him, your presence in his life is not fleeting at all. It is genuinely meaningful. And even if he does not show it in the way you might expect or hope for, the simple fact that you remain on his mind is real evidence that you have already become important to him. When an avoidant person creates distance between you two, it is easy to assume that his feelings have simply faded away. But in many cases, the exact opposite is actually happening. Distance is not always about him leaving for good. Very often, it is actually about him testing the connection instead. An avoidant person pulls back specifically to see whether the emotional intensity will eventually settle down, whether the connection will lose its grip on him, whether the feelings themselves will quiet down once he gives everything some space to breathe. This is a coping mechanism at work, not some final conclusion he has already reached. Avoidant people are essentially wired to regulate their emotions through separation. When closeness starts to feel overwhelming to him, distance becomes a natural form of self-soothing. It allows his nervous system to calm down, while his mind actually stays quite active underneath the surface. And that is exactly why, somewhat paradoxically, you often become even more present in his thoughts once he actually steps away from you. He is watching everything internally, not externally. He is quietly noticing whether he still thinks about you, whether certain memories keep resurfacing, whether moments the two of you shared still carry real emotional weight for him. And when they genuinely do, it unsettles him because the very thing he had hoped that distance would erase keeps stubbornly returning to his mind. This is exactly why pulling away from you does not actually bring him the relief he was hoping for. It brings him clarity instead. He slowly comes to realize that the connection between you two was not simply situational or temporary. It was not just about proximity or habit. You linger persistently in his thoughts because you genuinely reached him on an emotional level, not just a circumstantial one. And that particular realization is deeply uncomfortable for someone who relies heavily on independence just to feel safe in the world. From the outside looking in, this can easily look like plain indifference, fewer messages coming your way, slower replies, noticeably less initiative on his part. But internally, there is real evaluation happening underneath all of that. He is quietly asking himself questions he would never say out loud to anyone. Why am I still thinking about her so much? Why does this whole thing still feel unfinished to me? Why didn't putting some space between us actually fix anything? And here is the truly important part to understand. If distance genuinely worked the way he hoped it would, you would fade from his thoughts fairly quickly. Avoidant people simply do not dwell on people who do not matter to them in some real way. If he is actively testing the distance and you still remain firmly on his mind regardless, it means the bond between you two genuinely has real depth to it. It means something authentically emotional was formed, even if it was never clearly defined or spoken about out loud. This particular internal testing phase can honestly last much longer than most people would ever expect it to. Avoidant people do not rush their emotional decisions. They sit with them, observe them carefully over time, and try to regain their sense of equilibrium before ever taking a real step forward. That is exactly why pushing him during this particular phase often backfires badly. It tends to turn simple testing into full retreat instead. So if he seems distant right now, but you can still feel that the connection has not actually disappeared, trust that intuition of yours. Distance for an avoidant person is much more often a genuine question than it is a final answer. And if you continue occupying his thoughts while he is away from you, it is because the connection managed to survive the exact one thing he had hoped would make it disappear entirely. When an avoidant person cannot stop thinking about you, the underlying fear was never really about you doing something wrong. It is actually about you mattering to him far too much. You have reached a place in his life where your presence genuinely carries real weight, and weight to someone like him inherently creates a sense of risk. For someone who learned early on to survive by staying emotionally self-contained, that particular kind of importance feels genuinely dangerous, even when it also feels good at the exact same time. The fear does not typically show up as outright rejection. Instead, it shows up as hesitation. He slows down noticeably. He becomes far more cautious with his words around you. He might even convince himself that now simply is not the right time, or that something feels slightly off, without ever being able to actually name what that something really is. What he is reacting to here is not some flaw in the connection itself. It is the vulnerability that inevitably comes along with genuinely caring about someone. You represent a loss of emotional control to him, and that is precisely what frightens him so much. Not because you yourself are unpredictable in any way, but because his own feelings are. Caring about you means he can actually be affected by you. It means disappointment could genuinely hurt him. It means he might need you, or that he might be needed by you in return. And for an avoidant person, those particular possibilities touch on old, deep-seated fears around dependence, pressure, and emotional overwhelm. So instead of leaning into the connection, he protects himself by building emotional buffers around it. He might intellectualize the whole connection, downplay how deep it actually runs, or simply keep things undefined between you two. He tells himself he is being perfectly rational about the situation, but underneath all that careful logic is genuine fear. Fear of exposure, fear of being seen too deeply by another person, fear of losing the emotional distance that once kept him feeling safe. What makes all of this especially confusing is that the fear exists precisely because the connection between you two is real. Avoidant people do not fear people who feel optional to them. They fear specifically the ones who matter enough to actually change them as a person. If you genuinely were not important to him, there would be no internal struggle happening at all. He would not think about you the way he does. He would not hesitate the way he does. He would simply move on without a second thought. And yet, despite all of that fear, you remain firmly on his mind, because the part of him that genuinely wants connection has not disappeared at all. It is simply quieter than the part of him that wants to feel safe. That softer, quieter part of him shows up in his thoughts, in his memories, and in moments of longing that he may never actually express to you or to anyone else. This is exactly why an avoidant person can seem emotionally distant while still remaining genuinely attached underneath it all. The attachment does not simply vanish, it goes underground instead. And unless he eventually learns to tolerate real vulnerability, this fear of how much you actually matter to him will continue quietly shaping his behavior toward you. So if you feel him pulling back at some point, please do not mistake it for a lack of feeling on his part. Very often, it is actually the complete opposite. When an avoidant person is genuinely afraid of how deeply you affect him, it is because you have already touched a place inside him that truly matters, and that is simply not something he can easily forget, no matter how far he tries to distance himself from it. Understanding all of this is not about giving him a free pass to keep you confused indefinitely, and it is not about waiting around forever for someone who may never fully learn to close the gap between what he feels and what he is willing to show. It is simply about recognizing the difference between someone who does not care at all and someone who cares more than he knows how to handle. That distinction matters because it changes how you interpret the silence, the distance, and the inconsistency, not as proof of your own inadequacy, but as evidence of an internal battle that has very little to do with your worth and everything to do with his own unresolved fears. What you choose to do with that understanding, whether you decide to stay patient, set boundaries, or walk away entirely, is ultimately up to you. But at the very least, you no longer have to carry the confusion alone, wondering if what you felt between you was ever real. It was real. He simply has not yet learned how to stand inside that reality without flinching.